The stagecoach rattled to a halt in front of the sun-bleached sign that read, "Welcome to Burden, Arizona Territory." Elizabeth Harper clutched her bag tighter as dust swirled through the open window, coating her already travel-worn dress with another layer of the West's unwelcoming embrace. This wasn't how she had imagined her grand adventure would begin, but after 3 weeks of grueling travel from Boston, she had learned that imagination and reality rarely kept the same company. "Last stop, Burden," the driver called, his voice as rough as the terrain they had crossed. Elizabeth took a deep breath and stepped down from the coach, nearly stumbling as her boot hit the packed dirt of what passed for the town's main street. A handful of weathered buildings lined each side, most constructed of rough-hewn timber, with a few brick structures breaking the monotony. Men in dusty hats and women in practical calico moved about their business, each casting curious glances at the new arrival. "Miss Harper?" A thin man with spectacles approached, consulting a telegram in his hand. "Elizabeth Harper?" "Yes, that's me," she confirmed, attempting to brush some of the dust from her skirts. "Wilfred Jenkins, town clerk." He offered a quick handshake. "We received your response to Mayor Wilson's advertisement. I must say, we weren't expecting you so soon." Elizabeth straightened her shoulders. "I believe in being prompt, Mr. Jenkins." "Indeed." He eyed her small trunk and carpet bag with skepticism. "Is this all your belongings?" "It is." Jenkins cleared his throat. "Well then, I should inform you that there's been complications." Elizabeth's heart sank, but she maintained her composure. "What sort of complications?" "Mayor Wilson, the gentleman who placed the advertisement for a bride, passed away 3 weeks ago. Influenza, most unfortunate timing." Jenkins adjusted his spectacles nervously. "The telegram informing you must have crossed paths with your response." The blood drained from Elizabeth's face. "Are you telling me I've traveled 2,000 miles to marry a dead man?" Jenkins winced at her bluntness. "I'm afraid so, Miss Harper. The town council discussed the matter and, well, there's no easy way to say this, but we simply don't have funds to send you back east." Elizabeth stared at him, momentarily speechless. 22 years old, alone in a strange town, with no money, no prospects, and no way home. She had spent her last dollars on this journey, escaping a future as her ailing aunt's unpaid companion. "What am I supposed to do?" she finally managed. "We've arranged temporary lodging at Mrs. Abernathy's boarding house," Jenkins said quickly. "And perhaps, well, there are other eligible men in Burden who might be interested in a arrangement." "I am not merchandise to be passed to the next available customer," Elizabeth snapped, drawing curious stares from passers-by. Jenkins had the decency to look embarrassed. "Of course not. But you should know that women are scarce in these parts. Your situation, while unfortunate, could be advantageous." Before Elizabeth could respond, the sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. A rider approached on a magnificent chestnut stallion, pulling up sharply in front of the general store across the street. The man dismounted with fluid grace that belied his tall frame. Dust-covered and trail-worn, he nonetheless commanded presence with his broad shoulders and confident stance. "Who is that?" Elizabeth asked, momentarily distracted. "That's Beau Ironwood," Jenkins replied, lowering his voice. "Owns the largest cattle spread near Burden. Ironwood Ranch has been in his family for 2 generations, though he's only been back running it for about a year." Jenkins shifted uncomfortably. "He's not exactly sociable. Keeps to himself mostly." Elizabeth observed as Ironwood tied his horse to the hitching post. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 or so, with a weathered face that spoke of years under the harsh western sun. His dark hair curled slightly beneath his wide-brimmed hat, and when he removed it to enter the store, she caught a glimpse of striking blue eyes set in a face that might have been handsome if not for the perpetual scowl. "Miss Harper?" Jenkins interrupted her observations. "Shall I escort you to Mrs. Abernathy's?" Elizabeth nodded absently, her mind racing with options she didn't have. As they moved down the boardwalk, she glanced back toward the general store, only to find Beau Ironwood standing in the doorway, staring directly at her. Their eyes met briefly before he turned away, disappearing into the store's dim interior. "Mr. Jenkins," Elizabeth said suddenly, "how long has Mr. Ironwood been a widower?" Jenkins nearly tripped over his own feet. "Widower?" Oh no, Miss Harper. Mr. Ironwood is never married. There was talk years ago about a sweetheart back east, but he shook his head. That's just town gossip. Ironwood keeps his affairs private. I see. Elizabeth filed the information away, an idea beginning to form. Mrs. Abernathy's boarding house sat at the far end of town, a two-story wooden structure with a small front porch. The landlady herself was a round, efficient woman who welcomed Elizabeth with surprising warmth. "Poor dear, what a terrible situation," she clucked, showing Elizabeth to a small but clean room on the second floor. "You can stay the week without charge town council's orders, but after that, I understand. Thank you for your kindness." When Mrs. Abernathy left, Elizabeth sat on the narrow bed and finally allowed herself a moment of despair. Tears threatened, but she blinked them away. Crying wouldn't solve anything. She needed a plan. The next morning, Elizabeth rose early, donned her best dress, a modest blue cotton that brought out her eyes, and marched to the town's only newspaper office. The Burden Bulletin occupied a cramped space next to the barber shop, with one small printing press and stacks of paper everywhere. The editor, a middle-aged man named Thomas Garfield, looked up in surprise when she entered. "I would like to place an advertisement," Elizabeth announced before he could speak. "An advertisement?" he repeated. "Yes. I need employment." Garfield blinked. "You're the mail-order bride. Jenkins mentioned you yesterday." "I was intended to be, yes. Now I need work." Garfield studied her thoughtfully. "What skills do you possess, Miss Harper?" "I'm educated. I can read, write, and calculate figures. I've managed household accounts, and I'm a quick learner." Elizabeth held her head high. "I refuse to be a burden on this town's charity, or to be married off to the first man willing to take me." A slow smile spread across Garfield's face. "Well now, that's a refreshing attitude. As it happens, I could use someone to help organize my subscription records and perhaps assist with typesetting. It won't pay much, mind you." "I'll take it," Elizabeth said quickly. "When can I start?" "Right now, if you'd like." For the next 2 days, Elizabeth threw herself into learning the newspaper business. Garfield proved to be a patient teacher, and she discovered she had a talent for organization that transformed his chaotic office. By the third day, he had her writing small pieces for the weekly edition, announcements of church socials, and reports on local commerce. It was while researching cattle prices for an economic column that Elizabeth encountered Beau Ironwood again. She was leaving the bank, having interviewed the manager about regional finances, when she nearly collided with him on the boardwalk. "Pardon me," she said, stepping back quickly. Ironwood stared down at her, recognition dawning in his eyes. "You're the woman who came in on Tuesday's stage." "Yes, Elizabeth Harper." She extended her hand formally. He hesitated before taking it, his grip brief but firm. "Beau Ironwood." "I know who you are, Mr. Ironwood. Everyone in town seems to." A flash of irritation crossed his face. Small towns have long memories and little else to occupy them. "I wouldn't know. I've only been here 3 days." Elizabeth found herself strangely unwilling to end the conversation. "I understand you run a sizable cattle operation." "I do. I'm writing a piece on the cattle market for the Bulletin. Perhaps you could provide some insight." Ironwood's eyebrows rose slightly. "You work for Garfield?" "I do," she echoed his response, a small smile playing at her lips. For a moment, Elizabeth thought she saw amusement in his eyes, but it vanished quickly. "I don't have time today. I'm heading back to the ranch." "Another time, then," she said, refusing to be discouraged. Ironwood studied her for a moment longer. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect, Mr. Ironwood?" "Someone more defeated." He touched the brim of his hat in a brief gesture of farewell. "Good day, Miss Harper." Elizabeth watched him stride away, puzzling over the encounter. He wasn't exactly friendly, but neither was he as unapproachable as Jenkins had suggested. There was something about him, a guarded quality, that piqued her curiosity. Later that afternoon, as Elizabeth was organizing the printing type, Garfield mentioned offhandedly, "Saw you talking with Ironwood earlier." "Yes, I asked him about cattle prices for the article." Garfield chuckled. "And he actually spoke to you? That's unusual. Man barely says 2 words in town, unless it's business." "He wasn't particularly forthcoming," Elizabeth admitted. "No surprise there. He wasn't always so closed off, you know. Changed after the war. Garfield arranged papers on his desk. Joined up with the Union Cavalry in '62. Came back in '65 with a chest full of medals and a head full of ghosts, from what I understand. His family didn't help. His pa died while he was away. Mother tried to keep the ranch going, but it was struggling by the time Beau returned. He turned it around. Though, man works like he's running from something. Garfield paused. Then his mother passed last year. Since then, he only comes to town when absolutely necessary. Elizabeth absorbed this information, feeling a strange connection to the solitary rancher. She too knew what it was like to be alone in the world, to lose family and have to forge ahead regardless. A week passed, then two. Elizabeth's temporary position at the newspaper became more permanent as Garfield recognized her value. Mrs. Abernathy reduced her rent in exchange for help with the boarding house's accounts. Elizabeth began to make a place for herself in Burden. Though she still felt the townspeople's curious eyes following her, still heard whispers about the mail-order bride nobody wanted. It was a phrase that stung more than she cared to admit. One rainy afternoon, Elizabeth was hurrying back to the boarding house when a mud-splattered wagon pulled up beside her. Miss Harper. Beau Ironwood sat on the driver's seat, rain dripping from his hat brim. Mr. Ironwood, she acknowledged, surprised to see him in town during such weather. You'll be soaked through. Get in. It wasn't quite an invitation, more of a command. Elizabeth hesitated only briefly before accepting his outstretched hand and climbing aboard. His hand was warm despite the chill rain, calloused from years of ranch work. Thank you, she said, settling beside him. What brings you to town in this weather? Medical supplies. He nodded toward the back of the wagon, where several packages were secured under oilcloth. One of my hands got thrown from a horse, broke his leg. I'm sorry to hear that. Ironwood guided the team down the muddy street. Dr. Miller said it well enough, but he's running low on bandages and such. They rode in silence for a moment before Elizabeth spoke again. I never did get your insights on cattle prices. Ironwood glanced at her, a hint of surprise in his expression. You're still writing that piece? Among others, Mr. Garfield has been kind enough to publish several of my articles. I've read them. Now it was Elizabeth's turn to be surprised. You have? Your piece on the territorial legislature was well researched. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. You have an educated mind, Miss Harper. Thank you. The compliment warmed her more than it should have. They arrived at the boarding house, and Ironwood pulled the wagon to a stop. The rain had eased to a drizzle. But Elizabeth was reluctant to end the conversation. Mr. Ironwood, she began, would you be willing to grant me an interview about ranching in Arizona Territory? It would make an excellent feature for the bulletin. He studied her face for a long moment. Why me? There are other ranchers closer to town. But none as successful, Elizabeth said honestly. I'd like to understand how you've made Ironwood Ranch prosper when others struggle. A shadow crossed his face. Success has its price, Miss Harper. All things worth having do, Mr. Ironwood. Their eyes met. And something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits despite their different circumstances. Sunday, he finally said. I'll come by around noon. We can talk then. Elizabeth smiled. I look forward to it. Sunday arrived clear and bright. Elizabeth spent the morning in nervous anticipation, changing her dress twice before settling on a sage green that Mrs. Abernathy assured her was most becoming. She told herself her care was professional, wanting to make a good impression for the interview, but deep down, she knew there was more to it. Beau Ironwood arrived precisely at noon, his wagon replaced by the chestnut stallion. He had made an effort as well, Elizabeth noted. His clothes were clean, his dark hair neatly combed beneath his good hat, and he had shaved the stubble that usually shadowed his jaw. Good afternoon, Mr. Ironwood, Elizabeth greeted him, stepping onto the porch. Miss Harper, he nodded, then gestured to the horse. I thought we might ride out a ways. There's a spot with a view of the valley. Better to understand the ranch if you can see it. Elizabeth hesitated. I'm afraid I don't have a horse. You can ride with me. Ajax is steady. The propriety of such an arrangement was questionable, but Elizabeth found herself nodding. Let me get my notebook. Minutes later, she was seated sideways in front of Beau on the saddle, one of his arms securely around her waist, as Ajax carried them at a gentle pace out of town. Elizabeth was intensely aware of Beau's proximity, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the strength in the arm that held her. "Have you ridden before?" he asked, as they followed a winding trail into the hills. "A little, in Boston's parks. Nothing like this?" "You're doing fine." They rode in companionable silence for a time, the landscape opening up around them, golden grasslands giving way to rocky slopes dotted with scrub and cacti. The air was clearer here, carrying the scent of sun, warmed earth, and distant rain. Finally, they crested a rise, and Beau reined Ajax to a stop. Below them stretched a vast valley, bisected by a ribbon of green that marked a year-round creek. Cattle grazed in the distance, tiny specks from this height, and on a plateau to the west sat a collection of buildings, the main house and outbuildings of Ironwood Ranch. "It's beautiful," Elizabeth breathed. "It's home," Beau said simply, but there was pride in his voice. He helped her dismount, and they sat on a flat rock overlooking the valley. Elizabeth took out her notebook, but for a long moment she just absorbed the view, letting the peace of this place wash over her. "How many cattle do you run?" she finally asked, pencil poised. "About 1,200 head, not the biggest operation in the territory, but respectable." Beau leaned forward, forearms resting on his knees. "We've got good water rights, which makes all the difference out here." Elizabeth asked intelligent questions about breeding stock, grazing rotation, and market conditions. Beau answered readily, his initial reserve fading as he warmed to the subject. He spoke with knowledge and passion, occasionally pointing out features of the land that made Ironwood Ranch unique. "Your father chose well when he settled here," Elizabeth observed. "He did, though it was harder going then. Apache raids were common, water rights weren't established. He nearly lost everything twice before I was born." Beau's gaze swept the landscape. "He taught me that this land demands respect. You can't conquer it, you have to work with it." "Is that your philosophy as well?" "I suppose it is." He glanced at her. "What about you? What brought you all the way from Boston to be a mail-order bride?" Elizabeth tensed slightly. It wasn't a subject she enjoyed discussing. "Circumstances," she said carefully. "My parents died of fever when I was 16. I lived with my aunt after that. But when her health began failing, her son, my cousin, made it clear I was unwelcome. He had a wife who resented my presence. So you answered an advertisement." "Yes, it seemed an adventure, I suppose. A chance at something different." Elizabeth twisted her pencil between her fingers. "I had romantic notions about the West, about building a life here. And now that you're stuck in Burden—" "I'm not stuck," she corrected him. "I'm making my own way. It's not what I planned, but perhaps it's better." Beau studied her, his blue eyes thoughtful. "You're a remarkable woman." "Elizabeth Harper?" The use of her first name sent a small thrill through her. "Thank you, Mr. Ironwood." "Beau," he said, "if we're using first names." Elizabeth smiled. "Beau." They talked for another hour as the sun began its westward slide. Elizabeth learned that Beau had a younger brother studying law in St. Louis, that he preferred the solitude of ranch life to town gatherings, and that he read voraciously during the long winter evenings, history and philosophy, mostly. In turn, she told him about her childhood in Boston, her love of writing that had begun with childhood stories, and her dreams of someday traveling to Europe. "I should get you back," Beau said eventually, noticing the lengthening shadows. "People will talk if we're out too long." "Let them talk," Elizabeth said, with more bravado than she felt. "I've been the subject of gossip since I arrived." "All the same," Beau stood and offered his hand to help her up. "Your reputation matters." His concern touched her. They rode back mostly in silence, but it was a comfortable one. Elizabeth nestled against Beau's chest, his arms secure around her. At the boarding house, he helped her down, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for today," Elizabeth said. "The article will be excellent with all you've shared. I look forward to reading it." Beau seemed reluctant to leave. Perhaps when it's published, you might want to see more of the ranch. The creek has some nice spots for picnicking." Elizabeth felt a flush of pleasure at the invitation. "I'd like that very much." He nodded, touched his hat brim, and mounted Ajax. Elizabeth watched him ride away, her heart lighter than it had been in months. The article on Ironwood Ranch appeared in the next edition of the Bulletin. Elizabeth had written it carefully, painting a picture of the land and the man who tended it with equal respect. Garfield was impressed enough to give it the front page, a fact that caused some stir in town. Beau Ironwood was not a man who sought publicity. "You've made our resident recluse famous," Mrs. Abernathy teased over breakfast the morning the paper came out. "Half the town is talking about it." "I hope he doesn't mind," Elizabeth said, suddenly worried. Her concern was addressed later that day when Beau himself walked into the newspaper office, newspaper folded under his arm. "Miss Harper," he nodded to her, then to Garfield. "Tom." "Beau," Garfield returned. "What brings you to my humble establishment?" Beau held up the newspaper. "This." Elizabeth tensed, but Beau's next words eased her worry. "It's a fine piece of writing, factual without being dry. You have a gift, Miss Harper." "Thank you," she said, relief evident in her voice. "I'm glad you approve." Garfield looked between them with interest. "Elizabeth has been a godsend to this paper. Circulation is up 15% since she started writing." Beau's eyes remained on Elizabeth. "I'm not surprised. She sees things others miss." The compliment brought warmth to her cheeks. "You mentioned showing me more of your ranch," she said. "Does the offer still stand?" "It does. This Sunday." "I'll be ready at noon." Garfield watched this exchange with raised eyebrows, but said nothing until after Beau had left. "Well, well," he mused. "Interesting development." "It's just for another article," Elizabeth said quickly. "Of course it is." Garfield's smile suggested he believed otherwise. "Just be careful, Elizabeth. Beau Ironwood has walls built higher than the Rockies. Not many get past them." "I'm not trying to get past anything," she protested. But as the week progressed, Elizabeth found herself increasingly eager for Sunday. She told herself it was journalistic curiosity, but her racing pulse whenever she thought of Beau suggested a different truth. Sunday dawned clear again, and Beau arrived with a surprise, a gentle mare on a lead rope behind Ajax. "Borrowed her from the livery," he explained. "Thought you might enjoy riding on your own." Elizabeth was touched by his thoughtfulness. The mare, named Daisy, proved as gentle as promised, and Elizabeth quickly found her confidence as they rode side by side out of town. This time, Beau took her to the creek that ran through Ironwood land. They followed its course for a time, before stopping at a shaded spot where cottonwoods created a natural canopy. A small pool had formed where the water slowed, clear enough to see the sandy bottom. Beau spread a blanket he'd brought and unpacked a simple lunch of cold chicken, bread, and apples. They ate companionably, talking of books they'd read and places they'd seen or hoped to see. "I never asked," Elizabeth said as they finished the apples. "Why did you come back to the ranch? After the war, I mean. You could have gone anywhere." Beau was silent for a long moment, tossing an apple core into the underbrush. "I needed to heal," he finally said. "After what I'd seen, what I'd done, I couldn't be around people, not normal people, living normal lives. The war was hard on you. War is hard on everyone who fights it." His voice was flat. "But some carry more than others. I was a scout. Sometimes I had to make decisions that meant men died." Elizabeth reached out impulsively and laid her hand on his. "You did what you had to." Beau stared at their hands, then slowly turned his palm up to clasp hers. "Maybe, but I couldn't face crowds or noise afterward. Coming back here, working with the land, with animals that don't judge, it helped." "And now?" she asked softly. "Are you still healing?" He met her eyes. "I think I am. More than I have in years." The moment stretched between them, fragile and full of possibility. Elizabeth was acutely aware of his hand holding hers, the sound of the creek bubbling nearby, the dappled sunlight playing across his features. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Beau leaned toward her. Elizabeth held her breath as his lips met hers in a gentle, questioning kiss. She responded with a tentative pressure of her own, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest. The kiss deepened, becoming something more urgent, more needful. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing raggedly. "I shouldn't have done that," Beau said, though he made no move to increase the distance between them. "I'm glad you did," Elizabeth replied honestly. He traced the line of her jaw with calloused fingertips. You deserve better than a broken man on a remote ranch. Shouldn't I be the judge of what I deserve? A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. You're stubborn, Elizabeth Harper. So I've been told. Their second kiss was more confident, a mutual exploration of newfound feelings. Elizabeth felt something unfolding inside her, a sense of rightness she hadn't expected to find in this dusty corner of Arizona. When they returned to town that evening, they rode side by side, occasionally exchanging glances that said more than words could. At the boarding house, Beau helped her dismount, then kissed her hand formally before departing. It was a gesture of respect, acknowledging that whatever was growing between them would need to proceed with propriety in the public eye. The following week saw a courtship unlike any Burden had witnessed before. Beau began coming to town more regularly, often on the pretense of business, but always finding time to visit the newspaper office. Elizabeth wrote more features about ranching life, expanding to cover the challenges facing the territory's agriculture. Garfield, seeing the increased interest these pieces generated, gave her more responsibility at the paper. Their Sunday rides became a routine, though they varied their destinations, sometimes exploring different parts of the ranch, other times venturing into the surrounding hills. On one memorable occasion, they rode to a secluded waterfall where they swam in the cold, clear pool beneath it, Elizabeth in her chemise and petticoat, Beau in his underclothes. It was scandalous by Eastern standards, but out here, miles from the nearest person, it felt like freedom. Town gossip, of course, flourished. Elizabeth was now Ironwood's woman rather than the mail-order bride nobody wanted, a subtle but significant shift in status. Mrs. Abernathy kept a protective eye on her boarder's reputation, insisting that all visits from Beau take place in the parlor with the door open. Elizabeth endured the scrutiny with good grace, understanding it came from genuine concern. He looks at you like you hung the moon, Mrs. Abernathy observed one evening after Beau had left. Never thought I'd see the day. Elizabeth smiled. He's not what people think. There's so much depth to him. Men who've seen what he has in war often develop it, the older woman said wisely. The question is whether he's ready to share his life again. It was a question Elizabeth had asked herself. For all their growing closeness, Beau remained reticent about certain subjects, his deepest war experiences, his plans for the future, and, most tellingly, his feelings about permanence between them. As autumn approached, bringing cooler temperatures to the territory, Elizabeth felt a growing unease. She had been in Burden for nearly 4 months, had built a respectable position at the newspaper, and had fallen deeply in love with Beau Ironwood. Yet something held him back from committing fully to their relationship. The catalyst came in the form of a letter from Boston Elizabeth's cousin, writing to inform her that her aunt had passed away. There was no inheritance, medical debts had consumed what little estate existed, but the letter served as a stark reminder of how completely Elizabeth had cut ties with her past. Beau found her on the boarding house porch that evening, letter clutched in her hand, tears streaking her cheeks. "What's happened?" he asked, immediately sitting beside her and taking her hand. Elizabeth explained about her aunt's death. "I should feel more grief," she admitted, "but all I feel is untethered, like the last anchor to my old life is gone." "Is that a bad feeling?" Beau asked carefully. "I don't know." She looked at him, searching his face. "Beau, what are we doing?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" "This. Us." Elizabeth gestured between them. "We've been courting for months, but you've never spoken of where it's leading. Am I just a pleasant diversion until you decide to retreat back into your solitude?" Beau's face tightened. "You've never been a diversion. Then what am I to you? Because I need to know." She stood abruptly, pacing the small porch. "I came to this territory believing I would marry a stranger and build a life. That plan failed, but I found someone better. Someone I choose freely, with my whole heart." She turned to face him. "But if that someone doesn't choose me back, I need to know now." Beau rose slowly, his expression troubled. "Elizabeth, I care for you more than I've cared for anyone. But marriage, a life together, I don't know if I'm capable of giving you what you deserve." "What I deserve is honesty," she countered. If you don't love me? Of course I love you. The words burst from him with unexpected force. I've loved you since that first day on the wagon in the rain. But loving someone and being worthy of them are different things. Elizabeth moved closer, taking his hands in hers. You are worthy. Your past doesn't define you, Beau. What defines you is how you've overcome it, how you've rebuilt your life, how you care for your land and your people. She squeezed his hands. How you've opened your heart to me despite your fears. Beau pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. I'm afraid of failing you, he whispered against her hair. Of the darkness coming back and pulling me under when you need me most. Then we'll face it together. Elizabeth leaned back to look into his eyes. That's what marriage is, facing life's challenges side by side. For a long moment, Beau simply gazed at her, a storm of emotions crossing his face. Then, with deliberate movements, he released her, stepped back, and lowered himself to one knee. Elizabeth Harper, he said, voice rough with feeling. I came to town today with something I've been carrying for weeks, afraid to give it to you. From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet box. Opening it revealed a simple but elegant gold ring with a small diamond. It was my mother's, he explained. She made me promise before she died that I would only give it to a woman who made me want to be a better man. He took a deep breath. You are that woman. Will you marry me, Elizabeth? Will you come to Ironwood Ranch and make it a home again? Tears blurred Elizabeth's vision as she nodded. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will marry you, Beau Ironwood. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood and kissed her with a passion that spoke of all the emotions he struggled to express in words. Mrs. Abernathy, who had been discreetly watching through the window, sniffled loudly, breaking the moment and causing them both to laugh. I believe we have an audience, Beau murmured. We'll have the whole town as an audience soon enough, Elizabeth replied, admiring the ring on her finger. Burden hasn't had a wedding in over a year, according to Mrs. Abernathy. Then we'd better make it a good one. Beau's smile was more relaxed than she had ever seen it. How soon can you be ready? How soon can the Reverend be available? They were married 3 weeks later in Burden's small church, which was packed to capacity for the occasion. Elizabeth wore a new dress of ivory silk ordered specially from Tucson, with Mrs. Abernathy's lace veil. Beau cut a handsome figure in a new black suit, his normally unruly hair tamed for the occasion. Garfield gave the bride away, proclaiming loudly that he was losing his best writer, but gaining the satisfaction of having played matchmaker, a claim that made both bride and groom roll their eyes. The wedding feast afterward was held in the town square, with tables groaning under the weight of dishes contributed by every household in Burden. Even Jenkins, the town clerk who had originally delivered the bad news of Elizabeth's situation, seemed genuinely pleased as he offered his congratulations. As the celebration continued into the evening, Beau led his bride away from the festivities toward the waiting buggy that would take them to Ironwood Ranch. Elizabeth had already moved her belongings to the ranch house the day before, Mrs. Abernathy having insisted on propriety to the last. Ready to go home? Beau asked, helping her into the buggy. Home, Elizabeth repeated, savoring the word. Yes, I'm ready. As they drove away, the townsfolk cheered and waved. Elizabeth looked back at Burden, the town that had disappointed her hopes, yet ultimately fulfilled them in ways she could never have imagined. They're calling me the mail-order bride who found her cowboy now, she told Beau with a laugh. Apparently, I've graduated from being a burden. You were never a burden, Beau said seriously. You were a gift this town didn't deserve. I'm just fortunate you stayed long enough for me to find you. Elizabeth leaned against his shoulder as they traveled through the gathering dusk. It's strange to think that if Mayor Wilson hadn't died, I would have married him. We would never have met like this. I would have found you anyway, Beau said with surprising certainty. Some things are meant to be, Elizabeth. You were my reason to stop hiding, to start living again. I believe that with my whole heart. The ranch house welcomed them, with lamplight glowing in the windows. Beau's foreman's wife had gone ahead to prepare for their arrival. As they approached, Elizabeth saw the changes already underway, fresh paint on the porch, new curtains in the windows, flower beds dug along the walkway, awaiting spring planting, small touches that transformed a house maintained by a solitary man into a home prepared for a shared life. Beau handed the buggy reins to a waiting ranch hand, then turned to his bride. With a fluid movement that took her by surprise, he swept her into his arms. "Welcome home, Mrs. Ironwood," he said, carrying her across the threshold. Elizabeth wrapped her arms around his neck, feeling a sense of rightness, of belonging, that she had never known before. "Home," she agreed, "at last." 2 years later, Elizabeth sat on the wide front porch of Ironwood Ranch, watching as Beau demonstrated to their 8-month-old son how to pet a puppy's soft fur. Little James Edward Ironwood, named for both their fathers, giggled delightedly as the puppy licked his chubby hand. "Gently, Jamie," Beau instructed, his voice infinitely patient. "Like this." Elizabeth marveled at the transformation in her husband. The reserved, haunted man she had first met had gradually given way to someone more open, more at peace. He still had dark days when memories surfaced, but they came less frequently now, and when they did, he no longer faced them alone. The ranch had prospered under their joint stewardship. Elizabeth had applied her organizational skills and business sense to the operation, modernizing the bookkeeping and suggesting innovations that increased profits. She still wrote occasionally for the Bulletin, special features that Garfield was always delighted to publish. More significantly, they had opened their home. Where Beau had once lived in isolation with minimal staff, Ironwood Ranch now hosted community gatherings, provided employment for several burdened families, and served as a stopover for travelers. Elizabeth had started a small school for the children of ranch workers, teaching 3 days a week in a converted outbuilding. "What are you thinking about?" Beau asked, looking up at her from his position on the steps. "How much has changed?" she replied. "How happy I am." Beau smiled, the expression now coming naturally to him. "Even when you're carrying our second child and can barely see your feet?" Elizabeth laughed, placing a hand on her rounded belly. The new baby was due in just over 2 months, and Beau fussed over her constantly. "Especially then," she assured him. "I never imagined having all this when I stepped off that stagecoach in Burden." "Neither did I when I saw you that day." Beau lifted Jamie into his arms and came to sit beside her, the puppy following at their heels. A beautiful, determined Eastern woman with fire in her eyes, standing in the dust of Main Street, looking like she might take on the whole territory single-handed. "I was terrified," Elizabeth admitted, "but too stubborn to show it." "You're still stubborn." He leaned over to kiss her cheek. "It's one of the many things I love about you." From the ranch yard came the sound of approaching riders, Beau's younger brother Robert and his new wife Sarah, arriving for their monthly visit from Tucson, where Robert had established a successful law practice. "Uncle Robert," Jamie called excitedly, recognizing the riders. Beau stood with his son. "Let's go welcome them, shall we?" Elizabeth watched as her husband carried their child down to greet the visitors, his stride confident and relaxed. Behind them, Ironwood Ranch spread out in all its glory, cattle grazing on distant hills, fields of alfalfa greening the valley, cottonwoods shading the creek where she and Beau had shared their first kiss. This land that had once been Beau's sanctuary had become their shared kingdom, a place where healing and growth intertwined, where the past informed but did not dictate the future. And Elizabeth, once cast adrift by circumstance, had found her true north in the most unexpected place. As she rose to welcome their guests, Elizabeth felt the baby kick strongly beneath her heart. Another Ironwood, another chapter in their story. The mail-order bride who had been considered a burden by a small frontier town had found purpose, love, and family. And the solitary cowboy who had retreated from life had found in her his reason not just to stay, but to truly live again. The town of Burden lay miles away across the hills, but Elizabeth no longer thought of it with regret or resentment. Instead, she felt a quiet gratitude for its role in her journey, for it was there, in that dusty settlement with its unwelcoming name, that she had discovered her own strength and found the love that would define her life. As Beau looked back at her from the yard, their eyes met in silent understanding. They had both come home, in every sense that mattered, and home, they had learned together, was not a place but a feeling, the certainty that wherever they faced the future, they would do so side by side, their love a shelter stronger than any walls and more enduring than the western landscape that had brought them together.